And thank you for joining us for this Institute for Addiction Science Distinguished Speaker Series talk by Dr. Isa Lanza. My name is Adam Leventhal. I'm director of the USC Institute for Addiction Science. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our institute. We are a multi-school unit involving a collaboration from the USC Keck School of Medicine, the Suzanne Dworak Peck School of Social Work, and the USC School of Pharmacy, with 4 additional partnering schools. And our goal is to promote transdisciplinary, collaborative addiction science research, education, and community engagement. And part of our mission is to educate scientists and the public broadly about key issues related to addiction. And hence our speaker series and our wonderful speaker today, Dr. Isa Lanza. So let me go ahead and introduce her. Before I do her introduction, I just want to let you know that when we, as far as the format for this talk, you will be able to ask questions at the end. You can type them in the chat while Dr. Lanza is speaking, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Or you can hold them and type them in then. And if we're feeling very in an excitable manner, we will try to do live questions and open up your mics to the speakers in the audience. So we'll just see how it goes. Well, and with that, I'm very honored to introduce Dr. H. Isabella Lanza. She's currently an associate professor of human development and director of research for the College of Liberal Arts at the California State University, Long Beach, CSULB. As a teenager growing up in Los Angeles, Isabella had 3 goals: attend college in New England, check; become a psychologist, check; and join the FBI, no check. 2 out of 3 is pretty good though, right? Isa double majored in English and psychology at Williams College. And afterwards, she went to pursue a career as a marriage and family therapist at Pepperdine University, but she realized that her personality was not suited for clinical work, which I'm surprised to note after knowing her, because I think she could probably do most about anything. But after she got her master's, she went on to earn a PhD in developmental psychology from Temple University. And then following a postdoctoral fellowship in addictive behaviors research at UCLA and some adjunct teaching at CSUN in Northridge, she joined the Department of Human Development at Cal State Long Beach in 2014. And there she's able to enjoy the things she loves most. She loves teaching and mentoring undergraduates and conducting research on health risk behaviors. And with her training in developmental psychopathology and her postdoc training in addiction, she's really spent her career navigating both developmental psychology and public health to examine the processes and pathways underlying co-occurring health risk, all the way from early adolescence to young adulthood. So in her talk, Isa will be highlighting how developmental science, more broadly, can be used to better inform and promote the field of addiction science. So really excited to introduce Dr. Isa Lanza. Dr. Lanza, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adam, for that introduction. I'm going to now share my slides. Do let me know if you can't see them, but I think they're working.
I can see them. It looks great.
Great. So thanks everyone for coming today and just for listening to me talk a little bit about how developmental science may potentially inform addiction science. Try to forward my slides and it's not working. I don't know why. It was working earlier, but sorry, let me try again. There we go. Guess I had to press very hard. So I created a meme, and this is actually like the format you probably have seen in the last years that became very popular. I wanted to talk a little bit about what it means to be an addiction scientist throughout this talk, not just for me, but for you as well, and for you to reflect on what it means to you. And I definitely feel like I identify much better with being a developmental scientist and an addiction scientist. I do think it sometimes can be difficult to explain to people like what addiction science means. And we have a lot of different perceptions like across the board. A lot of times society thinks we're doing like just addiction treatment, and maybe we're like a therapist. A lot of times people think, oh, it's all fun because you work with drugs. And I don't know if people think we have access to drugs or what. But really, what it comes down to being an addiction scientist for me is continuing the work I do in developmental science, but obviously with the focus to addictive behavior. So hope you had a little fun with that meme I created. And speaking about interdisciplinary sciences today, there are many strengths, obviously, to being in an interdisciplinary science. And I just wanted to highlight like probably the two I find most significant. And one is those opportunities for innovation. And again, this is across the board with addiction science, developmental science. We always have this opportunity when we're working in an interdisciplinary field to not just ask like very meaningful research questions, but to ask those timely research questions. And I found this to be very true in addiction science is working with other people. You get a sense of not just what's important, but what's critical at the moment, like in our context right now. And another strength of interdisciplinary science in general is the ability to do more comprehensive, deep level conceptual modeling. Although I'll speak a lot about why this usually is a weakness because it's hard to do this in interdisciplinary science. Although if it happens, when it happens, it's amazing. And then some other strengths are related to refining methods and also better use of analytical tools. Because typically, when we're in a discipline, we are trained in specific methods or specific statistical approaches. But then when we start collaborating with others, we can see how we can refine those to make them more valid or accurate and just better uses, right, of those tools and designs. And then the second main strength, I think, is obvious because I've already mentioned it. It's that collaboration across disciplines. It can really bridge the gaps, especially between basic and applied research. And I think addiction science does this quite well, possibly better than developmental sciences, also addressing that gap between research and policy. And I think the work that IAS has done and that I see at T-Course at USC, it's so well done, like how research actually makes policy change happen. It's quite nice to see. And of course, a last strength is having a greater dissemination space, right, with the wider audience across multiple disciplines. But then here comes some weaknesses, right? So these are the things I'm really going to highlight today is how we can approach some of the weaknesses that are common in interdisciplinary science. These are things that also I find common in addiction science and how we can use developmental science to perhaps, you know, diminish some of this weakness, improve and advance addiction science. So the first thing is a lot of times in interdisciplinary science, we kind of neglect our discipline specific training in terms of our theoretical or conceptual models. And then we don't also go on and expand and create interdisciplinary theoretical or conceptual models. So in some ways, a lot of times that theory, the concepts, the things that some of us, it was really part of our discipline training, it gets lost a bit, right? It gets pushed away and maybe pushed away because the research questions are much more interesting maybe than this. There's also sometimes an issue with, I call it messy methods because I like alliteration, but it's not really that the methods are messy. It's more that sometimes in interdisciplinary science, and I see this in addiction science, there's some devaluing of certain types of methods. And, right away you might think like, oh, are you talking about like qualitative methods? And sure, yes, of course I am talking about things like that. But I'm also talking about other approaches, which I will mention soon in the coming slides. There can also, of course, be a lot of inconsistencies with how we measure the constructs that we create, what they mean when the disciplines are not coming together. And there is also the weakness of a dissemination mismatch. Now, the nice thing is in addiction science, I don't see this as such a problem. Again, the research and policies really align so well, but at the same time, there is room for improvement. And I will kind of shift to talking about social justice at the end of the talk and kind of make a plea for why we should all become, in a way, social justice researchers. So this slide is titled Old Habits Die Hard. This is really why I decided to focus my talk on speaking more broadly, and not speaking about my work specifically, but speaking more broadly about what it means to be in addiction science and come from another discipline, and how do you rectify like conflicts between those two. A lot of times in my experience, I find addiction science to definitely be interdisciplinary, but addiction scientists themselves to be quite disciplinary, right? So that's definitely a conflict we have. And sometimes it's actually a good thing to stay within your discipline on some things, but at the same time, it can be a barrier again to promoting like theoretical work or innovative methods or even like social justice goals. So one thing is I definitely have been examining like why might this happen? Why might we have this lure of belonging to our original discipline, or maybe a discipline and that we are attracted to? And probably a lot of it has to do with the fact that, you know, we're human. I'm a developmental psychologist. I study a lot of social norms work and peers. And when I teach adolescent development, I talk a lot about how, you know, it's so critical for peers to feel accepted, to fit in with the group norm, to be part of a social group for their identity. And in some respects, we never lose that. It just diminishes, hopefully, when we become more adult, like adults. And but at the same time, we might have some nostalgia for our discipline of origin. I think back to my developmental psych days, and I definitely have this, that, you know, that picture of people coming together and being cohesive and exploring ideas. And but it might not really have been true, but we have that lure of belonging to a group, right? And discipline training is a nice structural way to have that, you know, group social identity. So, saying that, I would really like to now speak about developmental science and just point to some recommendations I have about how we can use developmental science, some guiding principles in our addiction science work in the future, in order to like promote addiction sciences in ways that typically are held back a little bit right now, but could really do a great job in creating like a new, even a new dissemination space, or even a new status for our science. So, what is developmental science? Yes, does developmental science include pictures like this? Of course it does. But when I tell people, like, oh, you know, I'm a developmental psychologist or a developmental scientist, they immediately think, like, oh, so you study children's like family relationships, playtime, you know, happy emotions. And nothing wrong with that, because that's part of developmental science, but it's just a small facet. And so a lot of times we, you know, in society, we have this misperception of what developmental science is. And we typically think of it as a very gendered field where people are studying like, you know, babies and children being happy. Usually that's what we think. But let me give you a little bit of a discussion of where developmental science is now and what developmental science is to most people who are in the field at the moment. So I put up a quote here, and I won't read it, but it's from Richard Lerner. He is a very well-known developmental scientist at Tufts University. He writes an enormous amount of theoretical and conceptual papers on developmental science that have honestly changed our field in the last 20 years and have brought us to a consensus that I don't think a lot of people thought was going to happen. So we owe a lot to people like him, but of course others as well. But in terms of developmental science, the one thing I want to emphasize today, you know, and if there's one thing you're going to remember from developmental science, is that developmental scientists are really interested in the intra-individual change that is happening within people. And also, they aren't interested in group differences, they are interested in inter-individual differences, but within the intra-individual context. And I will bring this up again because it's something that can be hard to understand for addiction scientists, because individual differences tend to take a back seat. But for developmental science, this is really a priority now. As I said, there in the 20 years, we've had a lot of consensus around developmental science, but there's been this strong resistance in the past to interdisciplinarity among all our disciplinary fields. Some of those disciplinary fields aren't really disciplines, but I put them in there. But in that early 2000s, as a field, we kind of stopped thinking dichotomously. Like, so for 50, 60 years, people were all about, nature versus nurture, universal development versus context specific, continuous development versus discontinuous, right? And something changed in the early 2000s. In the last 20 years, we finally have come to accept a developmental systems approach as being the way that developmental science wants to move forward. And so this really started with Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory that probably most of you have heard, because it's always the developmental theory people talk about, and it's great, but we've also added onto it. So like Richard Lerner added onto that. And then more recently, Willis Overton has created this meta model and about developmental systems. And this is what I truly love about developmental science, is that our field finally took this approach of we have to create a theoretical framework that everyone can use, no matter what discipline they're in. So this relational developmental systems meta model really it emphasizes the relationships between individuals and contexts, or individuals and systems. So that's pretty much just the basis for it. So what specifically can developmental science do for addiction science? Here's some guiding principles that I'm going to highlight briefly today. And one, I've already mentioned these as weaknesses. So I'm going to mention them now as what we can do about it. Here's like theoretical conceptual model building. I definitely think taking a developmental systems approach, thinking about interactions and relationships between the individual and context more carefully in addiction science is, the wave of the future, because it's being pushed across other interdisciplinary disciplines as well, and it's not going anywhere, right? So that the context really matters. It's, and we have to think about the interactions, not just, separate modeling of individual and context. We also have to move more towards consistent methods. And I don't really actually mean like just a few methods. What I mean is maybe having more open-mindedness about methods that study intra-individual change. And so you'll see why this has been a little bit of a barrier in addiction science in a minute. And then the last thing is, again, I think addiction science does this application so well, but at the same time, using a developmental systems approach to focus optimizing development with an emphasis on social justice would be a nice recommendation for us moving forward as well. So let's speak a little bit about these three. And first, I just want to speak why, theoretical frameworks and conceptual models can be really important for your work if you're not so inclined to use them or focus on them at the moment. I read addiction behaviors work all the time, because that's really a lot of my work is in that field. And I find that research questions are so interesting, and they're timely, they're meaningful, they're significant. It's like, what more can you ask for? But at the end of the day, I can read 10 papers from like maybe a certain group or certain project, and I'm always left to wonder, like, what is this all adding up to, right? Like, because each paper seems like it has its direction, it has amazing implications, but I always wonder, like, what is the overall like conceptual model that they're building towards? What are the theoretical ideas that are framing these questions? Like, I want to know the background. Obviously, a lot of times in addiction science journals, like journals that take most of our addiction science work, there is very little room for this type of work to be expanded upon. But I urge you, even if you don't have the room, to think about it as you are writing up your introduction, or you are thinking about your research questions, and thinking about it from that developmental systems approach. Like, how are your research questions tied to these like mutually influential relationships between individuals and their contexts, their physical and their social contexts? I also I value conceptual models in my work, because I find that it really adds value to my papers, not just extrinsic value. Like, sure, it's quite nice when someone is like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Like, I can see why that's a research question. That's great. But it also adds intrinsic value to my work. It makes me motivated to do the work, and it adds a piece to my puzzle, which I'll show you in a second. And I also think, and I say this for the younger investigators in the Zoom room, it definitely provides the framework for your unique career trajectory, right? Like your unique identity in addiction science. I think that's something we all crave, is like what makes you unique versus all the other PIs versus all the other researchers out there. Having identity is really important. I think conceptual modeling can inform that as well. So I'm just giving you an example here. I'm not going through it again. This isn't really about my work specifically. It's just to show you how you can use a conceptual model to build on your own work in the future. But I developed this conceptual model to explain how adolescent obesity may be a risk for substance use in adolescence and young adulthood. And this really is like 10 years of my work. This is what I'm very interested in, is co-occurring obesity and substance use. It's not always what I write about or always what I do, but everything, every paper, every presentation, everything I'm thinking about is somewhere in this puzzle piece. You know, even if when I'm not writing a paper on obesity, I'm still thinking about this. And even if it's just about substance use, this is still in my mind, and I'm still thinking about how this paper or this presentation will contribute to something going forward that will fill in puzzles, right, of this larger model. So my interest, right, is the pathway from obesity to substance use, but really as a developmental scientist, I am more interested in the pathways, the specific pathways, like maybe it's, you know, through deviant peers or internalizing symptoms or weight management. And something I'll touch on in a second is also the importance of thinking about developmental processes in your work. It's like, why is this happening? Not just is it happening or what's happening, that's fine. But at some point, when we answer those questions and we get more consensus, we have to think about the why more, like the mechanisms underlying it. So all my work, I always think about that peer context, even if I'm not testing it, it's there. And maybe I'm going to look at, you know, something different, like gender influences on how obesity is related to peer victimization, or how peer victimization is related to maybe internalizing symptoms through self-regulation, and that might lead to certain types of substance use. But at the end of the day, everything I do, I can fit it in here. And that's really important to me. So speaking about our second guideline, this is about using some innovative methods, and using methods more that are interested or reliant more on that intra-individual versus inter-individual change. So just to refresh your memory, like from 5 minutes ago, developmental science is focused on how the individual changes across time, intra-individual change. Okay, remember that's like the focus, the emphasis of that definition I gave you a few minutes ago. But you all probably know that in addiction science and behavioral social health sciences, the focus is not on inter-individual change, it's on inter-individual change, right? Those population level differences. So you might think like that really conflicts, but this isn't mutually exclusive. I think with some innovative methods, you can test both of these in same models. You know, you can do both of these things. There's no reason why we should be leaving out intra-individual change. And we really shouldn't be leaving it out, because if we ignore it, we're also ignoring the fact that those why questions, like those developmental processes, right? We're ignoring that those have things like time varying means, they have variances, they have sequential dependencies, there's bidirectional relationships. So it's like we won't see that, we won't be able to test those things if we ignore intra-individual change. Now, I know bringing up intra-individual change is, you know, it can be somewhat of a new framework to think about methods with, because we are very interested in group level differences, population level differences. So, but let me just reiterate, I think everyone in here would agree health behaviors are dynamic, right? No one in here thinks that we can't change health behaviors, because the purpose of addiction science is to have optimal development as well, right? It's to reduce addictive behaviors. It's to change people who have addictive behaviors and hoping that they will, you know, either diminish or eliminate some of those addictive behaviors. So we all agree with that. But when we're thinking about things like risk and protective factors of addictive behaviors, the timing is just as important as the factors themselves. And when we're thinking about health behavior outcomes, which most of us study, when those changes occur, if they occur, if you're even studying change, right, that can be captured as well. But a lot of times we don't study changes, we just study like an outcome at a certain time point. So saying this, longitudinal designs are essential, obviously, but what's even more important is accounting for the fact that populations are heterogeneous, and also that the intra-individual change is key and has to be accounted for as well. And so for those of you who know me, like I'm a huge proponent of using late and longitudinal modeling. And this is most of the work I do uses something like a person-centered approach. Person-centered approaches, for those of you who aren't as familiar with what I'm talking about, are approaches or statistical techniques that emphasize the relationship across people and not necessarily the relationship across variables, because those are the variable-centered approaches like SCM or regression. So person-centered approaches are commonly things like growth mixture modeling or latent cost analysis. Those are quite popular. And, most of you probably do recognize that they hold a high reputation right now in social and behavioral sciences, but less so in addiction science. And a very smart man told me about 2 years ago, when I was telling him about a paper I wanted to do, and I think I wanted to use growth mixture modeling. I don't remember anymore. But when I was telling him about my idea, the method I wanted to use, where I wanted to publish it, and I'm sure it was some addiction journal. And he quickly just said, like, well, one of the problems in addiction science is like readers won't understand, and that can be a barrier to getting that type of work published in these journals. And of course, that's a huge bummer to hear when you're trying to collaborate with like a new group of addiction scientists. And I didn't really want to hear it. I guess I was just like, no, of course. I mean, maybe they're not going to understand all the details, but they'll ask for the details, right? I mean, that's what a reviewer will do. But I have come to understand, like, that person is very smart and probably does know what they're talking about, because in my experience in publishing in addiction journals, there has been a lot of pushback in using those late and longitudinal methods. And I kind of have figured out why, and I was reading some of Lerner's developmental work, and it made a lot of sense. Is a lot of times addiction researchers are inclined towards experimental design language. And if you're doing experimental designs, that's awesome, like props to you. But what I find is a lot of the reviewers, I don't think, do experimental design work. They're doing the work I do. They're doing like cohort survey, longitudinal study work, right? Or they're doing something else that's not experimental. But they're still using that language, and it comes across as sometimes like incorrectly confident. There's a subreddit with that title, I think, which is a great subreddit if you ever want to look at examples of that. But so it can be very difficult because you don't want to challenge a reviewer to turn them off from your work, but at the same time, you want to explain why this is also a great alternative to a variable-centered approach. So I actually got this quote from a reviewer a few months ago. This is a real quote. I'm going to read it very quickly because I just love it. So this reviewer says, I'm a little skeptical of the growth mixture modeling approach. There's basically no control group, and the findings are not falsifiable. This is especially true when we begin to talk about identifying latent classes or latent causes. And I was like, oh God, so much causal language. Where are these latent causes or classes? These are always inferred and unobservable. And I found that quite frustrating. But that reviewer, it was a great experience to talk back and forth with them over 2 revise and resubmits, because I was able to explain, like, look, we're using person-centered approaches to model intra-individual and inter-individual differences, and intra-individual change and inter-individual differences. But it's just an alternative. It's not trying to take away anything from a variable-centered approach. It's a supplement, and it has value. And so I show you the slide here. This is actually the paper that the reviewer read. It was just published a month ago with some my collaborators in T-course in preventive medicine. Again, I'm not going over the details of this. I'm just putting this up to show the value of doing something like a growth mixture model, right? Where you can identify inter-individual differences across trajectories, right? So this is one of the cohort studies that T-course has over 3,000 adolescents and young adults, and we followed them, right, for the 5 waypoints. And we were interested in identifying the unobserved subpopulations that were based on the probability of past 30-day use of 8 different cannabis and tobacco products. So that's kind of what this paper is about. And we identified these 5 trajectories, right? I'm not going to go through what all of them are. You can kind of tell from the patterns. But the point is, when you identify trajectories like this, yes, you can look at the group level differences. That's, we can look at B, which is like a young adult onset trajectory, and maybe see, will they be more amenable to certain preventions in the future? Do they have different outcomes than an increasing or a chronic group? So we're able to do that, and that's awesome, because that's what a lot of us are mostly interested in. But using a growth mixture model approach, we were also able to account for intra-individual change within individuals in each of these trajectories, because that method allows us to free up the growth factor on every individual, right? So this is a nice way of doing both things, getting what you want, right? And it's not, again, we're not trying to get rid of variable-centered approaches in any way, but it adds value. Like, you can find patterns of people and try to figure out, like, what do these patterns mean in terms of treatment, in terms of policy, in terms of health behavior change and outcomes. So my last guiding principle I'll talk about is the application of social justice. And so again, I refer back to the dichotomy that developmental science had for 50, 60 years. And one of those dichotomous conflicts was about there was a split between the basic researchers and the applied researchers. And the reason the developmental systems framework, understanding that individual context relationships is everything, like everything in our science. The reason it's so popular is because it not only resolves like our problem of, using theoretical models across those disciplines, it also helps us evaluate our innovative methods and understand what's more promising for those methods. It also does a great job of resolving the problem of how do we apply our work. Because if you take a developmental systems framework approach, you eventually test out individual contextual relationships. And anytime you test those relationships, you are going to change an individual's context, right? So you're changing the ecology. And that's really the belief of developmental science, is how can we change someone's context to have optimal human development? Because we believe we can have that change, right? Because development is amenable, right? It's dynamic, there's plasticity. Now, there's always been this talk in developmental science, like optimal development, optimal development, optimal development. But the problem is it's been quite focused on usually like privileged groups of people. And there hasn't been a lot of talk about like social inequities and inclusion. And so, of course, in the last 5 years, with all the social and political strife in our country and globally, there's been a huge push in developmental science to shift from talking about optimal development to speaking about social justice. And this is really important because dismantling like those, not just social structures, but policies as well, right, that limit access for marginalized groups is now a critical focus of developmental science. And I do think it should also be a critical focus of addiction science. Like, there's so much great policy work going on in addiction science. Why not also shift those thoughts to resolving social inequities? One of my last slides before I asked you guys to reflect a little bit is I read this wonderful paper recently, because I'm actually teaching child development for the first time in 10 years this summer. And I was picking up on like some newer, pieces that really talk about what's going on now in developmental science. And I encourage you guys to read this article. It's in Child Developmental Perspectives. It's all about how we can integrate equity and justice into our research. And, the authors start off really quickly by just saying, like, scientists must account for the impact of social inequities, regardless of the focus of the research. And they're not just talking about developmental scientists, they're talking about, everyone, right? So speaking to addiction scientists, speaking to others in interdisciplinary work. And I know when some of us hear like a push for social justice, it can make some people uncomfortable. It can make some people feel like they don't have the knowledge to do that, or they don't have the background to do that. And that's why I love this paper, because it understands like all the hesitation, and it comes from this approach of speaking to you like, if you're already doing this, then you can take the next step and try this out. And one of the things they mentioned that I'm going to do myself, and I try to do, but I never thought about it as like in a social justice way, is when most of us always put in demographic variables into our models, it's always in there as like, control variables or covariates. But we should also be thinking about what are those representing? What proxies are those representing in terms of social and cultural inequities? And going a step further and, thinking about what are the underlying processes, those developmental processes that might result in group differences across like social and cultural groups, right? So whether you're studying like gender differences, ethnic differences, sexual orientation, right, differences among immigration status, whatever differences you have, like what is actually explaining those differences. And I like that. I like that approach because it's amenable to probably a lot of the work we already have at our disposal, like all the data we've already collected. Um, my other push for social justice comes from the fact of what's going to happen if we ignore social inequities. And again, I don't say like I'm a social justice researcher. I don't ever speak about myself that way. But when I read this piece, I really thought about it. And it's true. Like if we ignore social inequities, our scientific rigor is going to be questioned. Like we can't just leave it up to a small group of people who study like the ethnic differences or the gender differences or the LGBTQ, differences, populations. We can't just leave it up to them to figure this out for us, because all our work will be thought of as biased if we don't account for inequities that are happening across the board to most of our participants. And for developmental science, this also will limit understanding of our developmental processes, the why, and of course the impact on the science will be minimized. And I think the same will be true for addiction science. It's like policies are wonderful, but if they don't have a strong impact across the population, then what is that because there are social inequities that some populations are experiencing, and different policies or revisions in policies need to be made, or maybe different approaches, resources, expectations need to be made as well. So it's just something to think about as we wrap up the presentation today. In my last 5 minutes, I wanted to take just a few slides to give you a feeling of like reflection. I know I speak quickly because I had a lot to pack in and I just couldn't say no to not putting in one of those guidelines. But I want you to think about how you, as addiction scientists or going into the field of addiction science, how you embrace interdisciplinarity. Because in my experience, if we're really not truly dedicated to being interdisciplinary, not just in our field, but also, within our own work, our individual work, it won't promote the science in the way we intend, right? We won't get to that level that we really should be at. And one thing I want to say is it's hard when you are in an interdisciplinary science, again, because you might be in conflict with a lot of your discipline training. But honestly, this definitely turns off investigators from true collaboration. I've had this experience in addiction science. I tend to gravitate towards that, work with somebody, and then run away because I just don't ever feel like my developmental science background is valued in addiction science the way it can be valued, obviously, in my own field. So I think it definitely can turn away really promising high potential young investigators as well. especially those from like underrepresented groups who are already looking for a social identity within their research. You don't want people to think like their work isn't meaningful enough to stay around, and probably not something us in the field who've been around 20, 30 years might be tackling as much anymore. But for those of us who are mentoring people now, or who have trainees, like these are definitely questions like we need to reflect on, like how well are we doing with our interdisciplinarity. And here are some questions that you can think about throughout the day. I was going to say when you get home, but you're home, so you can think about it now if you want. Here are some, just general questions thinking about the guidelines I talked about today. What theoretical frameworks are you using? Is that an easy question for you? Are you completely clueless at what you really are using currently? Do they need to be updated? Where are you using these from? Like, do they need a little bit of revision? Can you expand into another discipline? Do you think about how your ideas, research questions, and work fits into an overarching conceptual model? Um, Again, I understand some people don't have that overarching conceptual model, and that's fine because it doesn't mean you're not successful. Obviously, there's extremely successful people right here in this room now. But I do find that when you have something that can tie everything together like that, it can bring like a different type of value to your work that could help you stay in the field. There's people who are resilient and stay in this field, and there are many people who leave. And do you think about health behavior as dynamic and continually evolving? And you might be saying, yeah, sure, I do. But then how do your methods show that, right? Do you overgeneralize the population? I didn't have a lot of time to talk about adolescent substance use, but all the time I hear so many overgeneralizations of adolescents, and it's really painful. So we have to start thinking about our populations being more diverse and not just saying, of course, there's differences. No, think about like what qualitative differences really exist. And do you examine those relationships between individuals and contexts longitudinally? This is something I think addiction science could, jump on and just produce a lot of great work with. And finally, how well is your research aligning with social justice goals, right? How well are you combating social inequities in your work or promoting, the dismantling of social structures that marginalize people? Last slide here. For those of you who are like, oh, I want to learn a little bit more about developmental science, I hope I've, talked some people into branching out a little bit on that. I definitely encourage you as some first steps to like just read a little bit more from developmental journals. I think there's actually amazing longitudinal work on substance use and developmental psychopathology, but it gets buried a lot of times because it isn't developmental psychopathology. But I like that journal a lot for that work, and the other three are some of my favorites. And don't be scared to journal youth and adolescence. They have 8-page intros, so it's going to blow your mind if you're used to a 1-page intro, but it really helps you think about those theoretical frameworks. I would say attend a conference or meeting with a strong developmental presence. My favorite is Society for Research on Adolescence, but I think Society for Prevention Research would be a great one for anybody in addiction science at this point, even if you're an intervention person. Don't think the prevention word is excluding you. And do attend a statistics workshop if you are interested in learning more about like longitudinal methods. I know, some people out there are not doing like analysis on their own anymore. But for those of you who are and are interested in how do I measure inter-individual change, like how do I measure changes in general, like I definitely encourage you to check out like a stats camp or a ICPSR workshop in the summer because they're pretty amazing. And finally, collaborate with the developmentalists. We're out here. We're actually developmental scientists are a pretty friendly bunch and non-pretentious. I find us to be, maybe because we have to get over our child development perceptions. So we generally are friendly people and like to collaborate. So thank you so much for joining me on Zoom today. I also wanted to thank the collaborators of some of the work I highlighted in this talk, although I didn't talk a lot about my work. So of course the USC T-course people, especially I want to thank like Adam Leventhal and Jessica Barrington Tremis and Rob McConnell and Junhan Cho, because they really played an exceptional role, I think, in the last 2 years in some of the work I've created. And my mentor at UCLA, ISAP, Chris Grella, because she, even though she's an experimental psychologist, she like always has pushed me to never stop doing both my conceptual modeling and my statistical modeling. She's like, that makes you unique. You got to keep going forward with that. And I'm glad I listened to her. She's a great mentor. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Lanza, for such a wonderful talk. That was so fascinating. So at this time, you all can put your questions for Dr. Lanza either in the chat, in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your virtual hand. I'll keep an eye on the attendee list and any virtual hands that are raised. But we'll go ahead and keep an eye on the chat. Dr. Leventhal, I'll loop your psychology expertise in here as well. Do you have any comments or questions for Dr. Lanza?
Sure. Well, so first of all, that was an awesome talk. I really liked it. It's much different than like your traditional talk where you're presenting data, but not that that's bad, right? Obviously, like that's the cornerstone of academia and presenting, you know, whatever data and information. But like that was really fun, and you really thought deeply about this, and we all know that this isn't like a talk she just brought off the shelf. This is custom for us.
It was custom.
I loved it. I really loved it. And yeah, I think that you had a lot of tidbits that I've thought about too, and you really portrayed them eloquently. Like the struggle, the tension between whatever field you're in. Like my field is like experimental psychology, psychopathology, where the theory is rich, you know, and yours is, you know, developmental psychology. And then the kind of the tension between that and public health, right? And academic medicine. And then, but like how the tension is challenging, but it's also beautiful, right? Because that's what makes it interdisciplinary. So I really liked it, your talk a lot. I think you had some really good advice for folks out there. And yeah, we taped this, right? This would be something that like we should really. This is a keeper, right? And like, this could be a great. You can imagine this would be like a good commentary paper, you know, in an addiction journal or a developmental journal. Yeah, we'll definitely put it on the website. So, are there any questions? I'm not following the Q&A, but like I can ask questions too. All right. Well, no one's asking questions because no one's gonna be like, oh, how did you handle missing data on this? People's minds are blown. They're like,
it's for, I mean, I know my talk, like you need to come away with some deep reflection. It's not, it was more for people to think about their identity.
I think it's good. Yeah. All right. So we can like chat a little bit. Yeah, I think I don't know, whoever that dumb person who told you about, you know, latent growth mixture modeling you were talking about, how people won't understand it and all that stuff. Okay. But I think it's fun and challenging to twist the way you do your science, right? And so I think I was that person who told you that, right?
I know it was like, I think you're that person.
Yeah, but I would disagree with the smart part, but but yeah, because I'd like gone through this process where I write a paper and that we have like our paper with our conceptual model and our theory, and then like we're trained as psychologists. It's like, okay, in your paper, your introduction, you got to give a rationale. You got to review the literature. Everybody needs to know everything, right?
Yeah.
So, and you know, details are important in conceptual models. I love conceptual models. I should probably, this is like a good wake up. I should like go back and do more conceptual model stuff. But you know, one of the things I found, Isa, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, that I was disappointed that some of the work that I did that was really, I felt was conceptually rich, like it didn't get excited, right? And so, whereas the other stuff, where it's just like, here's an association between this and this, because it's really important, people need to know. And it could be due to like many different mechanisms, but this paper's not about mechanisms, what some of the work we did. So how, like, how have you thought about that and struggled with that or accepted it? Like when you have like this beautiful piece of work that you said can set you apart, right? Because you want to individualize. And then, but then, what happens like when no one cites it or only a few people cite it?
That's when I was talking a lot about like intrinsic and extrinsic value of your work. Because I do think, younger people, when they come into like an R1 setting, right, it's all about like, you got to get your publications out. And obviously I think about T-Cores and how you guys are making these extremely valuable impact on policy work, especially. And so it's hard to say, why wouldn't we produce these papers that may be a little light on the conceptual modeling, but they have immediate results on policy? And so I'm not saying that that should probably like be in any way reduced even, but at the same time, it's okay if not every paper is touching specifically on like your conceptual model, but it should also be a point where you think like, okay, I wasn't able to look at a underlying mechanism in this paper, but this will be like the foundation for that in the next paper. And maybe the next paper is not going to get so much attention because your original paper is what set everyone off and got them excited and produced policy change. But that's also where intrinsic value comes in. And I'm not an R1 researcher, right? So I don't have any pressure to publish at this point. I have never had any pressure like the way most people in this room have. So for me, like building a model is important because my work is something that I do almost like without a care of whether like it's going to get many citations. And that's probably not the way most of us want to think. But I will say, I know like the papers I do with T-Course will be highly cited and they were fun to do. But there's some papers that I love, like that conceptual paper I just published. That's probably not even going to get like 10 citations in the next few years. But I love that paper. I spent 10 years on that paper and it pushes me to work with people like T-Cores. Like that's the thing is like having my framework, it allows me to do some things the way I want. And then it also allows me to expand into places that I don't know a lot about, like the policy work. So I don't, it's kind of like a give and take. And I think when you're young and you're looking for a place within your discipline, within addiction science, our field, it's really important to have some intrinsic value, because I hear this all the time in grad students and postdocs and younger assistant professors is like, they don't feel like they have an identity. They don't feel necessarily like they're contributing because the lead PI is the one who's like the name and they're contributing, right? The atom is contributing. So so like some of us do need to find that intrinsic value more than others. And I'm one of those people. I to me, that's more meaningful, but not everyone. I wanted to say something though about the methods, like, and what you did tell me, like people are not going to understand this and how I find this frustrating in addiction science. The thing I will say is with that reviewer, and that reviewer gave me quite a hard time, but they came around when I explained like no one is trying to take anything away. And I definitely want to say this is like, this talk isn't about like dismantling things you do at all. This talk is more about, can you add a few things to make your work more valuable either to you or in some other field or some other research question. Can you add things to make your work a little bit more robust in terms of the method, like, oh, okay, so it has more legitimacy? And can you also add something so you can feel like you have a piece in social justice? And I think that's the other thing is most of the time, I like when people say social justice, I'm like, oh, those people. It's like they're a special group of people. But then I read about it, I'm like, we're all really doing social justice work in different ways. And if we push ourselves a little, we
Yeah.
could probably have even bigger impacts than you already have.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, I like that part of your talk too, and how I should probably read that paper that you were citing, but like that, like you got to push yourself. And I remember when I started doing some disparities research, like I don't know what this was, like 2012 or 13 or something. I kind of did a gut check. I'm like, can I do this? Like, like I'm a white dude, like I didn't train in this, I trained in psychological mechanisms, but then I'm like, I'm just gonna go for it. And I think that's what you're talking about, is like, don't be afraid, just kind of go for it. Because if more people go for it, it's
mhm.
better to have an error of commission than the error of omission,
Yeah,
right? Because if no one does
definitely.
it and it's just like a small group of people. So it looks like, so Evan has a question for you.
Yeah, I just read it. Thanks, Evan. I didn't realize you were here. I would have given you a shout out too. So I saw Evan's question, and like I said, that conceptual model has taken me 10 years of work. Like I started it at the end of my first year of my postdoc, and it's finally getting published like this summer, right? But I think over time, I've added theories to that. I've added mechanisms. I've added like other processes as I do more and more work. So I don't feel like your conceptual model ever stops growing. It is dynamic. It shouldn't just be something you have on, printed out and like you just keep looking at, but you never change it. And the reviewers of that paper also helped me expand on it. Like they pushed me in ways to talk about like epigenetics and biological predispositions in like ways that I had only touched on, but like really were pushed to do now. And that now is making me think that's what I want to do next as well. Like I want to move into that area. So it's a growth, and that's why I love developmental science, because we believe that nothing is ever perfect and we constantly can keep improving. And I hope some of you all will like maybe branch out and like try a conceptual model if you don't already have one in your mind right now.
Great advice. Yeah, I love it. You've been working on it for 10 years, and then you publish another update in 10 years.
Yes.
It,
Yes.
it'll be expanded, but also contracted probably in some ways. So
Hopefully.
yeah, well, thank you so much, Dr. Alonso, for your wonderful talk. And before you all sign off, Reed, who is the who is kind of behind the scenes and makes sure that we have a great speaker series. So thank you, Reed. We'll share. We have 2 additional lectures coming up. Kevin Montes and Tamika Sabalski, who will talk in some really interesting, more interdisciplinary areas as well. So we don't have titles yet for their talks, but stay tuned. And I bid you good day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.